Today on the Solar Podcast, DC coupled storage for CNI Solar and Storage. I'm Tim Montague, your host. The Solar Podcast is brought to you by Continental Energy Solutions. Today, my guest is Hanan Fishman, the CEO of Alencon Systems, and we're going to break down DC coupled storage and the storage market in general. Welcome to the show, Hanan.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Tim. A real pleasure.
Really excited to do another episode on DC coupled storage. I had Yaskawa Selectria on several months ago, and I'm not an electrical engineer. I know enough to be dangerous, and I know that DC coupling does make a project more efficient. And so that's one of the things that we're going to touch on. But before we get down in the weeds on DC coupled storage, give us a little background on yourself. How did you get into the solar and storage space?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I had the distinct pleasure of joining Alencon about 4.5 years ago, and that was about 7 years into a very unique journey for this company. So Alencon has been in, do the math on that one. Alencon's been in business for about 11 years, and we started out in life with a tremendously ambitious vision, which, by the way, we haven't given up on, but I think we've gotten a little bit more realistic on. So we started out in life with the vision of building the world's biggest inverter, which we did. We actually built a 10 megawatt central inverter, which in the initial design concept used a DC to DC optimizer as a distributed harvesting mechanism to basically do MPPT in the PV array and then step up voltage to a centralized DC bus where our 10 megawatt inverter would take it from there. So an incredibly unique product, incredibly ambitious vision. So we, like I say, we spent about the first 7 years of our life purely in an R&D mode. Literally didn't sort of commercialize the business. So I was brought in after about those first 7 years with the and given the remit of really bringing the company from an R&D state to a commercial state. And so at that time, we basically made a decision to pivot the business and said, look, we realized that, we are admittedly a smaller company. And so as a result, we took the decision and said, look, it's not that we can't commercialize this big 10 megawatt inverter, but it's going to take a whole lot of time and a lot of money and be very risky, which is a path we can certainly go, or we can take a sort of more immediate path to commercialization. And so as a result, having developed this very unique DC to DC conversion technology, that in the initial stroke was to support this large inverter, we sort of broke that off as a separate business. And so early on in turning that DC-DC converter technology into a product and a business, it became pretty obvious that DC coupling of solar and storage was a really fantastic application for that. And we had a lot of early success starting in about 2017, 2018, doing what were some of the first and at the time largest DC coupled projects out there that have been done to date. And so on the back of that success, that first of all, it gave us a lot of insight into the market. We were sort of an early mover, if you will, into a very sort of nascent field. It is still a nascent field. And as it happens, it just turned out to be a really fantastic application for the technology that we developed. So, obviously you can appreciate there's a whole lot more twists and turns, but that's the basic gist of how we got into this arena of DC coupling solar and storage.
A 10 megawatt inverter. Yeah.
Yes.
I would love to see what that looks like, but I also immediately go, well, yeah, that's very risky, especially given the trends in inverters, which is towards string. Where is that product now anyway? I'm just curious.
That's a great question. Where that product is it's an incredible piece of technology. Where that product is, as you can appreciate, it's a very ambitious undertaking. So we took that product just about as far as we brought it to about the point where we're going to UL list it. And that's where we sort of pivoted the business into the DC-DC arena. So, our goal in life is absolutely to come back to that. So I would say where that product is today, Tim, is in what I would call a pre-production state. It's not a commercial product by any means. I think for us to commercialize it, we would be looking for a partner. And that's a process that's ongoing. But quite honestly, in the meantime, what's happened, our DC-DC business has taken off, I would say to a degree, even far beyond our expectations. So we've got more than our hands full, really just being the best DC-DC converter company in the marketplace. So if I'm putting hand on heart, I don't exactly know when that big inverter is going to get commercialized. We certainly invested, as you can appreciate, quite a bit of money in developing it. And obviously we didn't invest that money not to sell the device, but like I say, right now we've got our hands more than full with the demand for our DC-DC products.
Now, I see from your LinkedIn profile that you have a background in software. So how does a software guy get into electronics?
Well, that's a good question. Digging a little bit deeper. So many years ago, through a unique set of circumstances, when I finished college with a degree in finance, accounting, and computer science, I did went to work on Wall Street and was an evil person for a couple of years. Worked at a place that's a bit more infamous now than it was then, called Lehman Brothers. I decided to leave there after a couple of years because basically turn a project I started in college into a business, which was this software company that what we did was we developed what was called computer-aided manufacturing software. So even though, yes, it was a software business, it was very much directed at what you would call mechanical type applications, really essentially CNC machining. So I spent the better part of 20 years doing that. That business that was, when we started, it was effectively myself and my partner in I believe it was a 10 by 10 office. Today is part of a $14 billion behemoth called Autodesk. So I think having spent 20 years, and again, not being a mechanical engineer, though, pretending to be one for quite a while, making the transition to pretending to be an electrical engineer wasn't so difficult. Fortunately, I've been very blessed to have a really fantastic technical team. And where, when I joined Alencon, really, and to a degree, it's still the case, is the real need was in growing the business commercially. Certainly, I think the bigger challenge has maybe been logistically. Again, I've basically been in manufacturing my entire career, but again, it's very different running an actual manufacturing company versus when you're just moving pixels around on a screen. And so again, I've been in the manufacturing world my entire life, but like I say, certainly doing it for real, it has definitely been an eye-opening experience. And but I think it's one we've really transitioned into well, as we, because we're now sort of at that point where we're very rapidly scaling our manufacturing, and that's really been a big focus of ours over the past 4 years, is really, as we continue to evolve the design of our products, evolving them to be really easy to scale from a manufacturability perspective.
Excellent. Well, what else should people know about Alencon before we get into the weeds on some of your on your products? I'm curious, this R&D background, was there a university affiliation, or what are the founders' backgrounds?
That's a good question. So it's a really interesting story, actually. There was sort of a university affiliation, but kind of in a little different context than you might typically think. So the Alencon was effectively founded by two guys. One is the founder, is a guy named Dr. Oleg Fishman. The other guy is kind of, depending on how you consider people famous, he got a little bit of notoriety a few years back back in 1991, this guy named Hank Rowan sort of stepped out of the shadows as the billionaire next door here in the Philadelphia area that nobody had ever heard of, and wrote a check for $100 million to a local small college called Glassboro State and renamed it Rowan University. This little story got a little famous a few years back because Malcolm Gladwell did a podcast on it, on this Henry Rowan fellow. So anyway, so Mr. Rowan basically built his fortune building the world's largest specialist manufacturer of induction melting systems, which is a company called Inductotherm. And so what happened was, as it turns out, the key to building a really big induction melting system is a really big inverter or a really big rectifier. So Oleg, who was Mr. Rowan's CTO for many years, basically Inductotherm back in about 2006 or so indirectly found themselves in the solar business because they were selling smelters to essentially people melting silicon ingot to make solar panels. So that got them snooping around shows like SPI, and they'd visit their customers, people like BP Solar, okay. But being inverter people, they naturally gravitated to the inverter side of the hall. So Oleg pitched Mr. Rowan this idea of starting an inverter company. And now, bear in mind, Mr. Rowan was about 80 years old at the time, and he says, I hear you. It's a great idea, but you know what? We're melting people. We're not solar people. But I'll tell you what, I think it's a great idea. How about me and you will start a company, Alencon. I'll give you enough money to get going. That money then rolled into, we were very blessed to get some pretty significant funding from the DOE's Sunshot program. So in terms of a university affiliation, we've always had a bit of an affiliation with Rowan University because, of course, Rowan University was sort of, if you will, tied to the hip of Inductotherm and Hank Rowan. So there's always been that affiliation. And that was certainly helpful in the early days. But that kind of gives you a sense of how we got from point A to point B.
Fronius has a welding connection, right? So that melting things is a thing, but it's cool. That's a good story. So I'm going to put your products page on screen, and we can start to dive into some of your target markets. You even got the big inverter there. I'm pleased to say, a little surprised to see it actually on your page, but it's good stuff. And before we dive headlong into the products, let's set the table a little bit with solar and storage.
Sure.
Most solar professionals know that storage is the bee's knees. Depending on the market, depending on the utility that you're interacting with, the value stack is different in different geographies. It's fascinating to me that the vast majority of storage professionals or storage service providers are focused on demand charge reduction, for example. That's not really a value stack for us here in the Midwest. We go after capacity charge reduction more, and then frequency regulation. But we've only done AC connected storage. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into DC connected storage. Why is AC connected storage more common than DC connected storage? Because frankly, batteries are DC devices kind of fundamentally, and you would think that, and solar panels are DC devices, you would think that there would be a natural evolution of that ecosystem. Perhaps it's the nature of the grid being AC that really drove it away from the DC connection, but set the table for us a little bit.
Well, yeah, so I think there's a lot of reasons. For one is, again, let's look at the history of grid scale or stationary storage, right, Tim? So most storage, I don't have the exact numbers, but I think it's safe to say greater than 75% of stationary storage on the grid is not co-located with solar. Okay, so historically, most storage by definition has been AC coupled because, again, it's been lashed to the grid for providing grid services, for providing backup to the grid. So obviously you've got this sort of really obvious synergy between solar and storage, right? Solar is great, but what happens when the sun isn't out, right? So it's just such an obvious sort of holy grail, peanut butter and jelly, pick your cliche, right? But so the reality is as large grid scale storage has evolved and continues to evolve, obviously the first systems were by definition, and again, still continue to be purely battery to grid. Solar just isn't even in the picture. So when this idea of putting solar and storage together, co-located, materialized, and again, that was a pretty obvious thing to do, AC coupling simply made the most sense because it was the easiest and cleanest way. People knew how to build solar plants. They knew how to build battery coupled systems. Obviously, as you know, Tim, in your business, the sort of slickest technical solution isn't always the most bankable solution, right? And so obviously all of these projects need to be financed. So better to go with the approach that is always going to be, if you will, bankable and deployable, versus one that's perhaps newer and less proven from a financing perspective. So I think that really more than anything gives you the primary driver for why you've seen things evolve the way they have. And then it gets a little more nuanced from there, right? I think you touched on it well when you said, in certain places, demand charge reduction is an issue, whereas in the Midwest, capacity is an issue. So for sure, I think, DC coupling, it's not to say that DC coupling is good and AC coupling is bad. It's way more nuanced than that. There's clearly going to be scenarios and applications where AC coupling makes all the sense in the world. And there's going to be other scenarios where DC coupling is going to make more sense. So I think what's happening is as the market for solar and storage in particular evolves, people are becoming more comfortable with what that nuance is. And to the point now where I think, again, I'm only too pleased to discuss those nuances. That's what we do for a living here. We help people understand those nuances. But I think the reality is I think the marketplace has gotten more sophisticated to the point where now you see RFPs for specifically calling out DC coupled projects. So it's no longer something that you got to really think too hard about. It's becoming more and more obvious. And again, I think some of both of course from the technology, from the likes of people like Alencon, have facilitated these things, but I think there's a whole variety of market dynamics. And again, only too happy to discuss where one makes sense, one versus the other. And then you were kind enough to pull up the products page on our website. The other element that we spend quite frankly a lot of our time discussing are the two types of DC coupled solar and storage, which is what we call the battery centric versus the PV centric approach to coupling solar and storage, meaning using a DC-DC to tie in between the PV and a DC bus, or using a DC-DC to tie in between the battery and a DC bus. And again, when either of those approaches becomes more appropriate is also an interesting one. So I think that's the other thing that's kind of gone on that's been interesting is that the DC coupling landscape has evolved to the point where there is actually nuance in how to do these things. And again, depending on the problem you're trying to solve, the facts on the ground, the revenue streams you're trying to capture, one versus the other can be the more appropriate way to go.
Yeah. One of the things that we see is the goal of future-proofing your solar project. There may not be, for example, battery storage specific incentives here in Illinois today, other than the ITC. But tomorrow there will be. And so if you're a solar developer, what do you need to be thinking about? Because literally every solar project could and will eventually be paired with storage. Massachusetts is mandating that now. Anything 500 kW and up is mandated to have storage attached, which is a double-edged sword. Granted, it does increase the CapEx, but it also, of course, greatly enhances the grid value of every solar project, right? The grid really wants and needs storage. And when you think about the transition that we're going through to electrification of transportation, for example, where we're going to triple the grid, this seems like something that we solar developers really need to become more sophisticated about.
Well, let me, if I may, just quick comment on what you've just said. I think you've just kind of walked into explaining why your listeners really need to care about DC coupling, because we can go into all the nuance, and again, I'm only too happy to go into any corner of it, but one of the major ones is a point you just indirectly touched on, which is future-proofing solar. And just get very specific, what I mean is that the big driver that I see, the number one driver, I would actually say, the number one driver that has developers calling us, asking them to help them with solar and storage projects, is because they are interconnect limited, right? So when you AC couple solar and storage, by definition, the size of the AC interconnect needs to become the sum total of your inverter capacity. So by definition, when you DC couple and you only have one inverter, one point of interconnect, you can achieve a lot more bang for the buck, if you will, in your interconnect. And then what happens is that then sort of dovetails into the next big benefit of DC coupled solar over AC coupled, DC coupled solar and storage over AC coupled solar and storage, which is the ability to capture clipped energy, right? So what happens is you want to maximize your interconnect. So what do? You want to put more DC behind it. Well, guess what? The bigger that DC AC ratio gets, the more DC generation you create, the more potential clipped energy you create, which again, when you AC couple, that all goes away. You don't have the ability to capture that. When you DC couple, you can now capture that excess generation. Maybe that goes on between the hours of, say, 10 a.m. and 2 p.m., again, depending on what marketplace you're in. Capture that in your battery and now run your battery for 4 hours in the evening. So I think the two sort of almost go hand in hand. On one hand, and again, Massachusetts is a perfect example, right? Because I think the other part of the story that you need to mention to people when you talk about the Mass and the SMART program isn't just that they want you to or require you to have storage over a certain interconnect size. They disincentivize you to build bigger projects, right? So what happens is now you want to add storage, but the bigger you get in terms of your interconnect, the lower your incentive gets. So people are always so you want to build up that DC side bigger, but you can only capture that benefit. They're almost forcing you into DC coupling is really the bottom line. So I think that's a really good example of, you say, well, why is DC coupling a thing now when it wasn't years ago? Well, again, you get the leading incentive program in the country, which is Mass Smart, and has basically pushed you in that direction. Again, the incentive is clearly created, right? They're saying, we're going to incentivize you to add storage, but we're going to disincentivize you to increase your interconnect. Well, that right away basically forces you down the road of putting your storage behind the inverter, behind the PV inverter, ergo DC coupling.
Interesting. And let's talk a little more about different storage markets. Mm-hmm. The big dogs are Hawaii, California, of course, Massachusetts, New York, and maybe New Jersey to some extent. Is there, of those that I just named, is there, thank you for putting your finger on Massachusetts and how that's driving DC coupling. Are there other markets that incentivize DC coupling?
I think there are. I think the SGIP program in California does. I'm probably less familiar with the nuance, only because, like I say, we right now we're just seeing, I guess the nature maybe somewhat geographically of where we live here, because we are in the Northeast. So I think we're more just intimately familiar with SMART. as I understand it, New York has a sort of a similar, if you will, incentive structure. But I think, more broadly, Tim, I think the other issue here is also around, I think coming back to the beginning of our discussion, is the issue of C&I and the needs, right? And so I happen to think that, the nature of the commercial and industrial market, right, is a market that is really particularly well tailored to DC coupling, because what a C&I customer really wants is energy that they can predict all of the time, and they want resiliency, has value. Okay, so now if that means we're bleeding into it's almost to the point where I'm not going to say every project we do, but let's just say a very significant portion of the projects we do that are DC coupled, I would say 50% or greater, have the label microgrid on them. There's and so again, microgrid is one of those words that gets thrown out a lot, and quite frankly, it gets bandied about, and it's appropriate. But the point is that when we talk about the commercial and industrial customer, they're not necessarily interested in making money on arbitrage. They're interested in making sure that their business is going to run uninterrupted, no matter what else is going on in the world. So I think again, that's an area where, again, if you want to be clean and we want to be clean and we want to be resilient, that's where the sort of fundamental dynamic of DC coupling just makes so much more sense. Is overbuild your DC, capture what you don't use at any moment in time in storage, and then let that storage run when your PV isn't available or is underproducing to completely meet as much of your demand as possible, versus throwing away what would otherwise be clipped energy in an AC coupled scenario, just because it's maybe and at the same time having some sort of limitation on your interconnect to the utility.
Okay. Should we talk about applications or dive into the products? You lead the way.
I mean, like I say, it's kind of up to you. I mean, if we want to talk about solar and storage, a product-based discussion makes sense. But certainly from an application perspective, you're sort of all over the applications tab there just a bit ago. Is I think broadly speaking, what's going on in our business. I mean, right now we're very blessed to be experiencing what can only be described as meteoric growth, and the fundamental reason for that, quite frankly, is that we are in, and this picks up on your point from earlier, Tim, is we're in a really unique sort of period in the history of power conversion. I know this may sound a little bit corny, but it really is the truth. I mean, if we go back to the history of power conversion, like the Tesla Edison days, going all the way back to those days, power conversion has been all about DC to AC, AC to DC, even AC to AC. And really what's happened here over the past few years, I think is the reason we pivoted our business the way we did 4.5 years ago. I think we had some insight into this, is that there's a real paradigm going on, and that paradigm has basically been driven by first and foremost, the rise of solar and storage. Also now electric vehicles, and I would even put fuel cells in that mix. I mean, fuel cells have been sort of the promise of tomorrow every year running for the past 20 years, right? But I think that day has really come, and we're really seeing that now on a significant scale. And the bottom line is very simple. What do all of these four sources of energy and as well as load have in common? They're all DC sources and loads. And so as you've indicated, these things, it just seems to make so much more sense to tie them all together from their original source of creation, which is DC. And again, this is where I think as Alencon, we've been very blessed, is that there's been a real paucity of commercialized high power, high voltage DC-DC converters in the marketplace. I mean, and again, that's why we made the pivot we did 4.5 years ago, is because we recognized that the demand in the marketplace, which we saw as growing and has quite frankly way outstripped our projections, to the supply, meaning the number of vendors offering solutions, which was really very few and far between, that gap is and again, it's been amazing to see. And no small part of our business is just finding ourselves into some of the other nuanced areas of storage. Like, again, there was a term you used earlier in this discussion, and which I think is very important because it's one that weighs heavily on our minds every day, is future proofing. And future proofing is somewhere we spend a lot of our time in talking with developers, because what happens is when you talk about storage as a medium, right? Particularly if you're talking about people who have come from the solar world moving into storage, particularly lithium ion based storage, has one fundamentally major difference than solar, which is, when you sell solar to somebody, you're selling them generation, okay? But you're selling them generation that really doesn't degrade all that much over time. I mean, yeah, there's a degradation curve, but it's not huge, right? But again, so effectively in year 5 to year 10, maybe to year 20, they're getting maybe a bit less than they were getting on day 1. But hey, it's bought and paid for, so it's all good. Storage, not the case, right? Because with storage, you're not selling generation, you're selling capacity, right? Imagine I came and I sold you a 20 by 20 closet, or your wife a 20 by 20 closet. She's got all these shoes. It's great. She loves it. Well, then after the second year, all of a sudden, maybe the closet's 18 by 20, and now she doesn't have room for her shoes anymore. So the point is when you sell somebody storage, you're offering them firm capacity on a degrading asset. So when you talk about future-proofing storage, one of the really hot areas that we're spending quite a bit of our time in, and it does happen to be a unique element that our product lends itself to, is this idea of augmentation. You don't build a solar project, say, hey, in year 5, I'm going to add another array. No, you don't think that way. With storage, you have to. And I would say this has been one of the more sophisticated, one of the areas where people have become more sophisticated. And certainly we see it at the utility scale. And this is going to it is now dribbling down into the C&I and distributed generation scale space. Is how do I augment what is my augmentation strategy over time? And again, this is whether that's with a standalone storage system or whether that's with a solar coupled system. So again, I mention all this because I think really your audience, if I'm not wrong, are developers. And my goal here is really to share what we see as granted, a technology manufacturer, but in that position, we're very blessed to see, I would say broad stroke trends, because quite frankly, our customers are running into these challenges, and these are the challenges we're helping them overcome. But I think that's a major one, and to the point where, again, when you look at storage RFPs anymore, in the RFP, it is not uncommon for the requester to say, what is the augmentation plan for this? Okay, because again, people understand that the battery capacity is going to degrade. There is a degradation curve, and unlike PV, that degradation curve, particularly with lithium-ion batteries, is very steep. And then the funny thing that comes off of the back of that, Tim, is that now you got to think, okay, how am I going to maintain this capacity? I've sold this guy, right? But at the same time, your method of doing that is, of course, to add more storage. But if you're going to have to add more storage, whether it's in year 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 of the project, you got Elon Musk out there saying, hey, in 2 years, batteries are going to cost half as much, right? So now it becomes that becomes a tricky one, right? Because so I know when I need to augment the capacity of this plant, battery technology will, by definition, have evolved significantly. It will have gotten way less, and it will have gotten much better. And so I think even though the storage market is still in its early days, the leaders in this field, and it's pretty obvious who those people are, have recognized this challenge and are now really getting stuck in on really solving how are we going to solve for this augmentation challenge. So I think that's another very important thing for your developer audience to be aware of, is not just to think about it like solar, O&M. Yeah, we got to have, O&M and make sure that things are reliable. It's not a matter of having good vendors and good EPCs. It's a matter of the fundamental underlying asset on a chemical and physical level is going to degrade. And what are you going to do, both technically and, quite frankly, financially, to address that over the life of the project? Because that all needs to be priced and it all needs to be addressed.
Well, I mean, it resonates what you say about augmentation. But I also, we're so early in the storage revolution that it's almost like a given, right? So anyway, how does your technology, let's talk about a specific product and explain to our audience, whether it's the Spot or the Boss, and you pick, and then I'll put that on screen and we can talk about that. But how this is going to make their lives better.
Okay, so the first question becomes, let's just keep it in the theme of today's discussion, which is the DC coupling of solar and storage. So let's just say, let's go to the point where the developer has said, right, I'm going to build this DC coupled project because I've got a limited interconnect. I want to capture clipped energy. The incentive structure is such that this is the way to go. Okay, so if you just scroll down the page, you see two very helpful pictures. One is of what we call the PV centric approach. And if you keep going, the other is what we call the battery centric approach. So let's just stop. We can just stop on this picture here. It's fine. So the first issue we need to discuss is, what do you need a DC-DC converter for to begin with? Like, what's it there for? Like, I understand why I need an inverter that converts DC to AC. What do I need this second piece of equipment for? So let's talk about what is a DC-DC converter doing to begin with. And what it's doing is, what you're doing now is you're putting two different voltage sources and voltage levels onto the same DC bus, meaning the same big piece of copper. So a solar array has a certain level of voltage. That level of voltage will differ depending on the rating of the PV strings, be they 600 volt strings, 1000 volt strings, or 1500 volt strings. So whatever your overall string lengths are, the voltage is going to vary based on something called maximum power point tracking, or the voltage that allows you to harvest the optimal power from the PV panels. Batteries, for their own part, have a completely different level of voltage range. It's a chart. So again, if you were to look at it, so if you look at any battery spec sheet, that spec sheet will say, okay, this is the charge-discharge voltage of the battery. Okay. Again, if you look at if you do some basic calculations, you'll know what the expected voltage ranges of the PV panels are. So those ranges, first of all, can be different. And second of all, will move for very different reasons. Okay. Because the PV is essentially going to move based on the weather, whereas the battery, the voltage on a battery changes based on supply and demand, whether you're charging or discharging your battery. So the role of the DC-DC converter is to effectively map one of those voltages into the other. So for example, in the picture you see here, you have an inverter connected to a DC bus, which is manipulating the voltage on that DC bus based on the maximum power point of the PV array, meaning it's trying to grab the maximum amount of power from the PV array by moving the voltage to find that ideal condition. So in this particular case, the role of the boss as the DC-DC converter is to effectively take wherever the battery's voltage is at that moment in time and map it into the voltage onto that DC bus. So effectively, if you will, when we talk about DC coupling, you always are going to need a DC-DC converter of some description to act basically as a valve between these two different levels of DC voltage, one from the PV, one from the battery, that are then moving for very different reasons. So that's the general concept of what we're doing. So then the question becomes, how do we do it? So you'll notice in the case of Alencon, this particular picture you're looking at here shows you, to the extent there's a more, if you will, traditional approach to DC coupling, this is it, because what this allows you to do is to basically couple batteries to a PV system using a PV inverter, okay? If you scroll up the page just a bit, you go to what we call our PV-centric approach. So this is an approach we counsel our customers to use when they have an inverter that maybe isn't a PV inverter, or there could be a whole lot of other reasons, but one reason might be that they want to use a battery inverter. So this is a good example. In so many words, in the PV-centric approach, we're using the DC-DC to do the MPPT and the PV array, and then deliver that constant voltage to the DC bus that the battery wants to charge and discharge itself, okay? So this is so in this example, it's as if we're plugging the PV into the battery, whereas if you scroll down in the battery-centric approach, we're actually plugging the battery into the PV. So that's the sort of general nature and roles that our products and products of its ilk play in doing a DC coupled project. So beyond this, we really then get into the nuance of why is it our fundamental technology is so much better and differentiated than what other folks who offer these kinds of products have. And really that's where we sort of get a little bit nerdy from an electrical engineering perspective, Tim. And really those two words are galvanic isolation, meaning what makes our products unique and is that they will allow you, they provide full galvanic isolation. And whereas other products in the DC-DC space don't actually offer that isolation. And getting back to the beginning part of our conversation about why do people just AC couple? Well, again, when you AC couple, yes, there's downsides, there's the interconnect, there's the clipped energy issue, but that whole issue of isolating two different sources, one PV, one being battery with their own, essentially with their own grounding schemes, it becomes a non-issue because they're by definition isolated. Well, now you're putting these two very different sources and loads on the same DC bus. There's a lot of value in having this galvanic isolation, or thus isolation of these two systems. And that is, if you will, the secret sauce that makes Alencon different from everybody else.
Very good. So are there applications when you need both kinds of technology though?
When you say both, what do you mean by both?
Meaning the PV centric and the storage centric?
Actually, believe it or not, there are, and we're seeing more and more of them. The challenge with those can be commercial, right? Because now you've got twice as much equipment. Without letting the cat out of the bag too much, we've got some technology coming down the pike to make that even easier. But the short answer to your question is that is absolutely a very real thing. And what that is, just to explain exactly what that thing is you're describing, is a fixed voltage DC bus topology. And you are going to, we have a number of, we've done projects like this, and we've got a number more in development where fixed voltage DC buses provide a lot of benefits. And the biggest one is the ease of integrating electric vehicles, right? So now imagine a scenario where you have one big piece of copper, you're feeding that piece of copper, that DC bus, from solar. You've got batteries hanging off of it on one side, and on the other side, you've got electric vehicles that are wanting to charge at a whole different level of DC current and voltage. And so those projects are, again, we're doing them today. You can say that there's still somewhat in the science fiction realm. I mean, well, they're definitely reality because we're really doing them, but are they huge? I would say not today. although we've got some pretty big ones on the go. But I think that is, and again, I think what you're seeing is as more and more clean resources get brought into projects, and again, that's where I bring up fuel cells. I mean, we're seeing, over the past 12 months ago, fuel cells were barely on our radar screen, barely. Today, they're let's just say, a very significant part of our business and perhaps a more significant part of our future. And again, same story with fuel cells, DC source and load, but very low voltage on the fuel cell side. So if you want to integrate fuel cells with renewables, which we're used to running at 1,000, 1,500 volts, you've got to make it work from a DC-DC conversion perspective. So the question you ask is absolutely a good one, and it's absolutely the real world of delivering more and more fixed voltage DC bus. And again, and where that's really going to coalesce is in the integration of solar, storage, and electric vehicles.
When you say that fuel cells are coming on, and I certainly see more news about hydrogen infrastructure. Is it just that the technology has reached some price point where it's now competitive, or what was the barrier to entry for fuel cells?
That's a great question. And it's one I get asked a lot, and I think the answer is it's not. There isn't a simple answer. I think there's clearly a technology issue, but I think really more than anything, it's an appetite for clean generation. That is really, I think, where fuel cells have now found their day, is that the tenor and the drumbeat for clean burning and really clean, not quote unquote natural gas, is just so loud that solar by itself, wind by itself is not enough to check that box. And so I think really that's what's happening.
Yeah, I think I think it's very hard today to get excited about hydrogen because it is such a rare thing on the grid, but tomorrow it's a major player. And I've heard some stories that Europe is now making a major initiative to invest in converting natural gas infrastructure to hydrogen infrastructure, which makes perfect sense. Apparently the infrastructure is quite compatible. And the way I see it is it just gives us so much more flexibility. A battery, you need electrons in, you get electrons out. A fuel cell, you can take hydrogen and get electrons. And so it's just an added layer of flexibility. And you can produce the hydrogen using solar and wind and other clean technologies. And water is super abundant. So therefore, theoretically, green hydrogen is super abundant.
Right. And again, if you haven't sort of figured it out already, I'll clue you in. Our goal in life here in Alencon isn't to pick the winners and losers from a technology perspective. Simply put, we see a gold rush on and we're the guys selling shovels. So, and whether that's hydrogen, it's solar and storage, it's electric vehicles. Right now, what we are seeing is an unbelievable demand, which again, because of this really rapid rise of this need to marry up very different levels of DC current and voltage into a common modality to make them all play in the sandbox together.
Yeah. Are there any specific use cases you can give our audience examples of?
For fuel cells?
No, for any of your tech, I'm just thinking case studies in general.
Oh yeah, I mean,
for Alencon, I think it's always good to give a tangible example. Interestingly, my local mass transit district is installing hydrogen infrastructure now for an additional fleet of fuel cell buses, and they're going to make the hydrogen locally. Hopefully partially with solar power, but anyway, what case study or two would you like to talk about?
Well, I mean, again, so many to talk about, like where to begin, right? So it comes down to what is the nuanced domain that you'd like to hear about. So,
Well,
so
for, what we talked about earlier on, everybody wants resiliency. That's kind of a foundation. If they can get that, the million dollar question is for how long, right? How long do you need to operate in island mode? 5 minutes or 15 hours? But let's talk about C&I resiliency and how your products play in that space.
sure. I mean, and again, that's really our bread. Let me give you a perfect example of a project we recently did. It's a small project, but very typical of the ones we do. It's a what you would call a quote unquote microgrid out at a hospital in Denver, where that's, as you can appreciate, that's what a hospital wants. They want resiliency, so they essentially built I think it's about a 250 kilowatt canopy solar carport on the top of their parking garage. They had our spot devices out in the PV array. They had a Samsung battery connected to a DC bus. I think they also had a combined cycle generator as well on there. So that's a very real world example. And then the other key bit, again, from a technological perspective, this is one of the other things when we talk to developers, we just always, it's just a drum we always pound. And by the way, it's not what we do, just to be clear, is this issue of controlling all these things. And so you whenever you do one of these projects, you have what you call a microgrid or a system controller that basically is the conductor, if you will, of the orchestra that tells the various components, it tells the inverter when to send power to the battery or when to discharge the battery. So I think that's one very, very real world, just kind of plucked out of my head example. I'll give you another great example. I mean, this is not just a project, but also a concept we're super excited about. Is kind of right now we're actually using we have one particular customer, we're using our products to, if you will, deploy what I call the gas station of the future, which is, if you think about, it's interesting the way EVs actually get charged. And as it turns out, and I would encourage both yourself as well as your audience to dig a little deeper on this on their own, just to confirm I'm not telling you tales. When you listen to people who really know something about EVs, they'll all kind of tell you that the biggest bottleneck to broader adoption is actually infrastructure. Because what happens is the way EVs get charged today, by and large, is not very efficient. Because if you think about the way a gas station works, right? How does a gas station work? A gas station, you pull up, there's basically this big container under the ground with gas. You bring your car up, you pump what you need, and away you go. And every few weeks, that container gets refilled by a tanker truck. Well, most electric vehicles, the way they get charged, you pull up to an EV charging station, you charge your vehicle, but that charging station is connected to the grid. That's as if that gas station was connected to a refinery, right? Yeah, you can do it, but you're going to need some pretty big pipes. And so as this may sound shocking to you, is actually quite frankly quite shocking to me when I first got into it, is right now there's actually very little infrastructure that allows electric vehicles to be charged in a similar way. So we've got a number of customers that what they're doing is they're essentially locating a battery at the site, okay? And again, a battery has a certain charge-discharge voltage. An electric vehicle has a certain charge-discharge voltage. And so again, it becomes the role of the DC-DC converter to convert that one level of voltage from the source, the battery, even though it's being charged from the grid, but in a way that's sort of very sensible and predictable to that vehicle, right? So that's something that we're seeing quite a bit of. We've got a number of projects like that on the go, and that.
Let me ask you a question about that. Is there an efficiency to be gained though by doing DC to DC charging? I hear about fast DC charging. I'm an EV owner,
Okay.
so I'm learning about these things, and the reality is that you have to charge a lot, right? If you're driving, say, a trip of 300 miles, you might charge twice on a 300-mile trip. even though technically the range of the vehicle is 300 miles, you don't get 300 miles of range. You might get 180 miles of range. Um, but if you don't have to convert AC to DC, is there a major financial
The
incentive?
advantage is not actually in the efficiency of the conversion, Tim, because ultimately there's probably going to be a DC, again, unless you get into that DC bus architecture I was telling you about, which is still very early days, just leave it at that. Although, things will evolve quickly, you can be assured. The benefit is more on the infrastructure side. And let me explain what I mean by this. Pretend you're a real estate developer. You're building, say, a new say Whole Foods, and you want to have EV charging stations. Well, you go to your utility, you need an interconnect. Now, you know what the Whole Foods is going to need. It's got so many refrigerators, so many lights, fine. So you know what your load looks like there. But then you want to have these EV charging stations. You don't really know what that load looks like, right? Because cars could be coming in and out all day. You may not see anything. So what do you have to do? You've got to size for your worst case scenario, right? And these things are absolute, they're not gas guzzlers anymore. They're current guzzlers. So this idea of locating a battery at the point of charge isn't so much, because ultimately the battery is going to be the car is going to be charged in DC. In this instance, what you're doing is, again, and the people who develop these projects will tell you, many of them, not all of them, because we have some customers who feel differently, but a number of them will tell you, yeah, solar is the last thing they want to get involved with, because there's land, there's permitting, there's all kinds of other challenges. They don't want to know about solar. So what they're assuming is there's an abundance of cheap, clean power somewhere in the area, be it, most typically, of course, wind, right? Because at night, they pay you to take wind in some places. So the idea is that you can, say, charge your battery at times when the electricity is very inexpensive. It's now there in a reservoir, much like it is that gas station. And so now you don't have to worry about taxing the grid as those cars come up on the daily and charge themselves. Okay. So where is that helpful? Because what happens is, if you don't have that battery acting as that reservoir, you now have to depend on the utility, the grid operator. Well, the grid operator didn't design his grid infrastructure for that kind of current draw, that sort of intermittent. So that's it. The benefit of that gas station of the future isn't so much about making your car more efficient to charge. It's about making it's about eliminating the cost of infrastructure upgrades to facilitate a broader EV charging infrastructure. And that's what I say people in the know will tell you is really the limiting factor, is how do we put all of these new current hogs on our distribution grid without either crippling the grid or, becoming cost prohibitive to upgrade the grid to support. It's a classic problem of, the technology of the future was not designed to go with the infrastructure of today. So that's really I'd say.
So your point is that the battery, it's going to have to be a big battery. The battery is going to be like a fuel tank. It's going to smooth out the load on the grid.
Yeah, these are container-sized batteries, the kinds you see in ESS or utility scale type scenarios, so we're talking about battery energy storage containers. Absolutely.
Cool. Well, we only have a few minutes left, Hanan. This is a great conversation, and we should probably do a follow-on, but what else should our listeners know about Alencon, and especially around the future? Where is this technology going, and what do developers need to be thinking about?
It's a great question. And I mean, I think, certainly as far as Alencon is concerned, what I would encourage developers to do is to think about how we can help them. Because again, ultimately, yes, we are a manufacturer and a technology provider, but we have expertise in these nuanced areas of DC coupling of solar and storage, augmenting battery systems, charging electric vehicles. So as they see challenges, feel free to approach us. We're happy to share our expertise and kind of give them guidance. But for sure, I mean, the bottom line is the theme, and it is so obvious, right? And again, you said it right at the top of our discussion, is look at, I mean, the direction of travel is so obvious. Solar, storage, electric vehicles, fuel cells. They are all DC sources and loads. That is a fact. They all need to coexist. No, none of them unto themselves is a solution to our clean energy future. But in tandem, they are. The challenge is they're all different DC current and voltages based on their operating sort of principles. If we want to merge them in one single productive lump, we're going to have to figure out a way to make them work together, and that's the role of the DC-DC converter. So I think a device that you probably didn't give a whole lot of thought to, it may be a very big part of your future going forward.
Cool. Yeah, the nature of these tipping points is you just don't see it coming. It's ice, water. Unfortunately, that acronym ICE is also an acronym. I'm not talking about ice engine.
Sure.
I'm talking about ice cubes. So think back to high school physics and chemistry, and that is how markets work. And we are at that moment. We're actually going off the cliff now. We're doing a phase shift, and all of a sudden, every solar developer has to also be a storage developer and expert. So you're sitting in the catbird seat, man.
We're trying.
How can our listeners reach you, Hanan?
Always great to hit our website, which is www.alenconssystems.com. Certainly, info@alenconssystems. You shoot us an email. Obviously, you can call us. We do pick up the phone. We're old school that way. Even have a toll-free number if that, I don't know if toll-free even matters anymore, but 888-410-7915. Or if you want to go the old-fashioned way, 484-436-0035.
Awesome. Well, I have a couple of announcements. I want to remind our viewers that they can find all of our content at cesnrg.com/videos. That's the Continental Energy Solutions website. Every week, we're bringing you topics like tools for solar development, land siting, utility scale solar development, solar project reliability and performance, fire safety and energy storage, trends and trackers and modules, all kinds of wonderful topics from real deep experts. So please check it out, hit that subscribe button, give us a thumbs up, and share it with your friends. We really appreciate your viewership, and we hope to find many more viewers. The reality is that we are growing this industry by leaps and bounds now. Tens and tens of thousands of new people are coming into this industry, and we need more and better information. So also, if you have thoughts on what a good topic or guest would be, please reach out to me on LinkedIn or by email, tmontague@cesnrg.com. I want to thank Hanan Fishman, the president and CEO of Alencon Systems, for coming on the Solar Podcast today. Thank you so much, Hanan.
Hey, Tim, thank you so much for having me.
Look forward to seeing you again soon.